In January 1849, Inverness suffered one of its worst floods ever recorded. It destroyed the old seven-arched stone bridge which had stood for over 160 years. Much of the town was under water, but worst affected was the west side of the river, which was under several feet. Many took to boats to escape the rising levels, leaving their houses to the mercy of the flood. No lives were lost, but much damage was done to property over the 3 days between 25th and 27th January that year. The weather that January was unusual. It was stormy, mild and very wet, with long periods of heavy rain, particularly in Inverness district. Thunderstorms kept people awake at night as the flashes crossed the darkened skies. All this brought rain that swelled the river Ness. On the afternoon of Wednesday 24th, the waters of the Ness burst their banks, swamping the nearby roads at Ness Bank, Douglas Row, Huntley Street, Tanner's Lane and King Street, while houses were flooded. The stone bridge was closed by the authorities that afternoon following a structural survey. By 8 o'clock that evening, the water was reaching above the piers and was travelling at speed through the arches. The gateway at the west end of the bridge was being policed by an officer who only allowed a few people on foot to walk across it, even though the water had burst onto the road. Many in their houses wondered about how strong the Caledonian Canal would be against the deluge, and whether the water in it would end up bursting its banks and swamping the town. Few slept that night as they waited for the high tide at 1 o'clock. At Gilbert Street, a water gauge was installed, and many in the local area walked to it to find out the water levels. Most had expected the water levels to fall as the tide lowered. Instead, it kept rising. From 3 until 5 that Thursday morning, the levels were monitored as the Ness continued to rise. A few minutes before 6 a.m, the old bridge collapsed under the strain. The noise was described by the police officer stationed on Bridge Street as a rumbling sound, as he saw portions of it disappear into the boiling fury of the river. The bridge had been constructed between 1681 and 1684, with the £1,300 required to build it being raised by public subscription, but it had been dogged with problems. Its loss was felt in the town, as it had been the rallying post for Highlanders who'd managed to survive the bloodbath of Culloden in 1746. When news of the bridge collapsing spread to Merkinch, the locals wondered how long the old wooden Black Bridge would stand. At around 8 o'clock that night, word reached people that one of the Ness suspension bridges was on the verge of collapse. It did, and it was witnessed being tossed about in the river like a wooden log. This caused panic. It was feared that if it came in contact with the Black Bridge and was stopped in its wake by the posts, then use of that bridge would be put into jeopardy, as it would block passage. Luckily, these fears were unfounded, as it made its way through without causing any further damage, except for the loss of a couple of posts where it first hit the bridge. The iron suspension bridge finally came to rest on Capel Inch, where it became stranded. Although the Black Bridge had been closed to traffic since the previous night, people on foot could cross it, if they dared. As a few brave souls walked across, they reported a definite quiver in the roadway, yet people were surprised it had withstood the storm, as it was not as strong a structure as the old stone bridge. People gathered on the east side, escaping the rising waters from their homes at Green of Muirton and Merkinch. Many were carrying some belongings they'd managed to rescue as they made their way to the public buildings that had been opened up by the local authorities. The town hall, Dr. Bell's institution, the poorhouse and the Gaelic church all opened their doors to those affected. Heating and food were provided by the town council. Police officers were stationed at the old bridge to keep onlookers at bay and for their own protection. By this time, all that remained was a small portion of the parapet and a broken pier. The river here reached the walls of the houses from the corner of Gordon Place to the gable of the building once known as Castle Tolmie that flanked the riverside. This was made up of shops on the lower floor with a hotel above and stood at the north side of Bridge Street. But on the Thursday morning, all the road at the western gable and a wing of the building facing the river were swept away in the torrent, but the rest survived, only to be demolished later to make way for the widening of the approach to the new suspension bridge. The Ness could be seen touching the top of the first-storey windows of properties on the west side. The authorities were quick to act. Early in the morning of the 25th, they organised rescue parties to help with the removal of people from their flooded homes. A few stories were later recounted by the rescuers, such as an old lady wading through the rising waters with a bundle on her back, exclaiming in Gaelic that this did not come without a reason. The church had taken a dim view of a theatre company performing in Lowe's rooms in Church Street, hence the old lady's ravings. In the area of Duff Street, the same rescue party came upon a low-thatched house, but from an upper window, a piece of burning peat was being waved at the end of tongs by John Fraser, known as John the Weaver. He didn't want to be rescued, but to be given a pennyworth of peats and a stale loaf. Stale loaves were cheaper than fresh ones. 3 sisters lived together, and when a rescue party went to pick them up, they refused to be carried on the shoulders of the men, as they had never been dependent on men, and they were not going to avail themselves of any such immodest or ridiculous methods. Tom Russell, a blacksmith, suggested they be floated out in a large washing tub. It didn't work, and they ended up having to be carried and were safely deposited on dry land. The last person to cross the ill-fated bridge was Matthew Campbell, a sailor. He'd been visiting his hometown at the time and helped in the aftermath of the disaster. He left Inverness bound for India, but died on the journey. An old sundial on the top of one of the piers of the old bridge was rescued. It had been made from red sandstone and had been carried downstream during the flood. A search got underway, and when it was found, it was passed into the hands of one of the magistrates, who rewarded the finder with a large sum of money. It fell into many hands following the death of this magistrate, but ended up in the possession of Charles Fraser Mackintosh of Drummond, who kept it safe for many years. A temporary wooden pedestrian bridge was constructed, while a new suspension bridge was being built to replace the old stone bridge. This bridge opened in 1855, lasting until 1959, when it was replaced by the concrete bridge that still exists today. The Black Bridge was replaced in 1895 by the Waterloo Bridge. Inverness still suffers periodically from flash flooding. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.